welcome to History House. I'm your host, Owen Delaney. Let's begin. Before starting this episode, I would like to thank everyone who listened to the first show, along with the overwhelmingly positive feedback I've received from you, the audience. Of course, this podcast is about my own interests with history, but it's great to see many of you are excited about this project, and hopefully you will continue to tune in with each instalment. Thank you, Gurmahagut. Now, this is where the fun begins. The first proper episode of the show. Episode 2, Ottoman Help During the Irish Famine. This subject is largely based on the thesis to my master's degree in Middle Eastern history, and some parts I am repeating word for word. However, I've tried to adapt it to make it less technical and more easy to understand for a wider audience. I have also attempted to convert British pound values in the 19th century with their value today, and for each number I will say the original figure followed by its worth as calculated in May 2024. I've used the Bank of England's inflation calculator, and I'm including a link to this in the description. And with that, let's get started. To His Imperial Majesty Abdulmajid Khan, Emperor of Turkey. May it please your Majesty, we, the undersigned noblemen, gentlemen, and inhabitants of Ireland, beg leave most respectfully to approach your Majesty in order to testify our deep-felt thanks and gratitude for the munificent act of benevolence and attention lately displayed by your Majesty towards the suffering and afflicted inhabitants of Ireland, and to thank your Majesty on their behalf for the liberal contribution of £1,000 lately given by your Majesty to relieve the sufferings of the Irish people. This is from the address from the Irish nation to the Sultan, the 5th of June 1849. A good starting point to all this is, of course, examining the famine itself. The Irish famine on Gorta Mór in the Irish language was a critical period in Irish history, triggered by failures of the potato crop through blight, first occurring in the autumn of 1845, with a much more extensive failure in 1846, resulting in widespread deaths and emigration. While numbers vary, it is generally accepted that around 1 million people died, and another 1 million people emigrated to places such as Great Britain itself, Canada, and the United States of America. These figures are made more shocking considering that in 1841 Ireland had an overall population of just over 8 million in the census of that year, meaning that the population of the island decreased by about 25% in just over a decade. Given that all this was the result of one crop failure, it raises questions as to why there was widespread suffering across Ireland, given that this disease simultaneously was to be found across Europe, with deaths outside Ireland estimated to be 100,000 for the whole continent combined. There are three answers to this, the first being the role of this vegetable as a staple crop, in that it could be grown in a relatively small area, and on average, an Irish male of this period consumed between 10 to 12 pounds of potatoes daily, according to the Irish famine historian Christine Keneally. This leads on to the second point, the landlord-tenant system in Ireland. Many Irish farmers were tenants who did not own the land that they farmed, but rather rented it from landlords, who were generally Anglo-Irish Protestants, descendants of British people who settled in Ireland from the 1600s onwards. Under this system, when an Irish farmer died, the land was not inherited by the eldest son, but was rather subdivided among the farmer's sons, resulting in smaller landholdings among tenants from generation to generation. Given the large area required for other crops and the relatively small land for potatoes, there was a greater dependence on this particular crop, which resulted in a greater starvation crisis when famine did eventually strike, and was compounded by the further inability of farmers to pay rent, owing to crop failure, which in turn led them to be evicted from their lands by their landlords. The third, and perhaps most controversial point that heightened the humanitarian crisis was the British response. Ireland, since 1801, was governed from London, and consequently the authorities who could provide the most assistance were British politicians in Westminster. At first, the British response seemed surprisingly fair. The government of Sir Robert Peel in 1846 purchased £100,000, about £10.19 million in May 2024, worth of Indian corn from the United States, and repealed the controversial corn laws, which kept food prices for wheat, oats and barley at high levels. Further, according to Ciarán Ó Murchada in his book The Great Famine, Ireland's Agony 1845 to 1852, the British government overall spent £8 million, about £936.15 million on relief measures in Ireland. While this last figure seems very generous when compared to the other 2 points of prevent and further starvation, this number consisted largely of loans to farmers, which would inevitably have to be paid back. Although £1 million, 117 million of this, would later be written off in 1853. Further, if we are to consider the £20 million, nearly £2 billion in 2024, which was set out in compensation for slaveholders in the Caribbean following the abolition of slavery, a controversial measure when viewed in 2024, and the £69 million, 6.2 billion today, spent on the Crimean War in the 1850s, the 8 million sum seems small when compared to the figures spent on issues outside the heartland of the British Empire. Even the generosity of the Peel government in other areas wouldn't last. His repeal of the Corn Laws made him a rival to many politicians in the Conservative Party, and in June 1846, Sir Robert Peel was replaced as Prime Minister by Lord Russell. Unlike the previous government, Russell's administration adopted a more hands-off approach, favouring the ability of the free market to solve problems rather than decisive intervention on their part. For example, they viewed high food prices as an incentive for farmers to sell any surplus produce, but this measure would only result in many families relying on famine relief unable to purchase sufficient foods. Another controversial relief measure was the creation of workhouses, in which individuals would offer their services through work in return for food. For the majority of the people suffering from starvation, workhouses were seen as an absolute last resort, as according to Ciarán Ó Murchada, admission to these institutions meant, quote, institutional dependency, effective loss of citizenship, and human dignity. This reluctance to enter them would be heightened by their high mortality rates. For example, in Fermoy Workhouse in the south of Ireland, out of 2,294 individuals admitted from the 1st of January 1847, 543, or nearly 24%, had perished within 2 months. Public work programmes were another way of providing aid, but there would be considerable difficulties in dealing with the large numbers of individuals applying for work in these projects, and they would subsequently be abandoned. A more effective measure of famine relief were soup kitchens, which according to Peter Gray were issuing as many as 3 million daily rations by July 1847. However, exaggerated reports of souperism, Protestant missionaries providing aid in return for conversion of Irish farmers who were overwhelmingly Catholic, would generate a severe backlash among the Catholic clergy, creating an increased sense of bitterness between the two Christian denominations. In any case, this particular relief measure was ended by August of 1847 as a result of the belief that Irish property must pay for Irish poverty among the British public, but also as a consequence of fallen food prices at this time, proof among the British government that their free market policies were working, among whose fiercest defenders was the Assistant Secretary to the Treasury, Sir Charles Trevelyan. At first glance, Trevelyan's position has little to do with providing famine aid and resolving this humanitarian crisis. However, as Christine Keneally has pointed out, his constant interference in the daily administration of the Central Commission, founded for famine relief, enabled him to cement his, quote, authority on relief proceedings in Ireland, while removing those who opposed him. Further, Ciarán Ó Murchada has pointed out how heavily he was involved in relief efforts by virtue of his, quote, control over the purse strings, and how, with the approval of Prime Minister Russell and the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Sir Charles Wood, he was able to exert, quote, an influence on policy that was much greater than normally permitted a civil servant. Similarly, Peter Gray has noted that through his role as the chief civil servant at the Treasury, he was able to play an enormous role in shaping policy for famine relief. Finally, Christopher Gleeson has emphasised that Trevelyan's role as Assistant Secretary to the Treasury during this period, 1840 to 1859, made him the Treasury's highest ranking civil servant, a position made ever the more important in terms of famine relief by the dependence on bodies such as the Board of Works, the Poor Law Commissioners, and the Commissariat towards the Treasury in London. In short, I believe it is safe to say that Trevelyan played a decisive role in the British government's response to the Irish famine, far in excess of the traditional parameters of his position. Trevelyan, like other figures in Russell's government, was a proponent of a free market process in which non-interference was perhaps its key principle. While work projects as a form of famine relief could be seen as justified initially, Trevelyan, by defending their phasing out in 1847, was of the mindset that the worst of the famine had been fended off, and that from now on it was up to the markets to improve the situation. Such a policy had a considerable impact on mortality rates over the coming year, emphasised by the term Black 47, which has come to be seen in popular memory as the worst year of this humanitarian catastrophe. Trevelyan's mindset was also influenced by the idea of providentialism, arguing that alongside upholding the principles of free trade, there should be limited government intervention, as the famine was, quote, the judgment of God on an indolent and unself-reliant people. In short, like other contemporaries such as the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, the Earl Clarendon, and the Church of Ireland Archbishop of Dublin, Richard Whately, viewed the famine as an act of divine judgment, heightened by the fact that the Irish were overwhelmingly Catholic and the British were overwhelmingly Protestant. Alongside this mindset, by which British officials viewed the famine, the historian Peter Gray has also suggested that the response of the British authorities needs to be viewed through the lens of colonialism. He has argued that this crisis was seen from Britain as, quote, an opportunity to deny the benefits of common nationality until Irish society had been remoulded according to British norms, while also resulting from, quote, colonial stereotyping and attempted social engineering. Claims such as these are certainly bold, and while other historians have not gone to the lengths of Gray in emphasising racial integration and social engineering, there appears to be broad agreement that the British government ultimately failed in providing relief and preventing deaths. Whether deliberate, accidental, or as a consequence of mismanagement, there is a wide agreement that the British government had the resources and capital to reduce the staggering rate of deaths resulting from this famine, with motivations for not doing more ranging from economic, political and social. In the midst of the Irish famine, the question remains, what was happening in the Ottoman Empire at this time? This state, from 1839, was engaged in far-reaching reforms and westernisation called the Tanzimat, literally translated as reorganisation, a series of wide-ranging reforms within the empire which had a dramatic impact on the fabric of the state, upending centuries of traditional methods of governing and changing completely the society and everyday life of its inhabitants. The starting gun for this reformation was the Rose Chamber Edict in 1839, which among many other provisions sought to guarantee life and property rights through new laws and went in tandem with discussions for a new penal system which would apply to both Muslims and non-Muslims throughout the Ottoman Empire. In the words of the influential Middle Eastern historian Lord Kinross, this decree represented, quote, the earliest constitutional document in any Islamic country, with many further reforms undertaken, such as the mail-in of letters, the establishment of the first privately owned newspaper in the Ottoman Empire, Geschichte et Hadith, both in 1840, and the 1844 reform of coinage, just to name some of the changes that took place in the 1840s. There have been many debates about the reasons why the Tanzimat reforms were begun, with the Turkish historian Şükrü Haniolu pushing the following argument. In presenting the author of the Rose Chamber Edict, the Ottoman Foreign Minister Mustafa Reşid Pasha, as, quote, the foremost proponent of Ottoman accession to the European concert, Haniolu argues that this declaration served as, quote, an assurance to the great powers that demanded domestic reforms in return for future recognition of the Ottoman Empire as a member of the concert of Europe. In other words, by reforming the empire along European/Western lines, this state was hoping to be recognised as an equal nation in relation to Britain and France, not in the views of these powers as a backward, quote, uncivilised fate and power, which could leave the Ottoman state as ripe for colonialism on the part of these empires. Overall, it is this line of argument that this episode will view these reforms, as it can provide part of the rationale behind the decision to provide aid to victims of the Irish Famine. Thus, in providing assistance to a humanitarian problem under British control, as will be discussed later, the Ottoman Empire was perhaps attempting to attain recognition as a respected foreign nation and a, quote, European nation at that. There was another side to these reforms and the later provision of aid to Irish famine victims. The Russian Empire, which bordered the eastern frontier of the Ottoman state and was expansionist in nature. This empire had a long history of war with the Ottomans and had over time acquired Ottoman territory, such as during the Russian-Ottoman War of 1768 to 1774, resulting in the Ottoman loss of the Crimean Peninsula, and more recently through the 1833 Treaty of Hunkar-İskelesi, which granted Russia the power to close the Dardanelles to foreign ships if required, but also their ability to act as an independent state. Britain, at the same time to all this, was engaged in a high-stakes game of political rivalry with the Russian Empire, called the Great Game, in which both powers were competing for influence in places such as Iran and Afghanistan, and was thus a natural ally to the Ottoman Empire in this regard. Indeed, the proximity of British colonies and protectorates to the Ottoman Empire, such as in Gibraltar, Malta, and the Ionian Islands off the coast of mainland Greece, and the Trucial States, the modern-day cities of Abu Dhabi, Dubai, and the wider United Arab Emirates, made Britain a close proximity ally who could offer real support in the event of Russian interference, not a distant country in Northern Europe if it was to be stripped of its empire. The British clearly understood the importance of maintaining the status quo within the Ottoman Empire, viewing it through the lens of the Eastern Question, a series of political debates about what was to become of the territory of this empire, owing to its decline and gradual loss of territory, leading it to be known throughout the West as, quote, the sick man of Europe. Britain clearly favoured the maintaining of the empire's territorial integrity as much as was possible, and it would intervene in a rebellion against the Ottoman Sultan by the governor of Egypt, Muhammad Ali Pasha, in 1839. In this case, when Ali's forces refused to withdraw from Syria, the British proceeded to shell the port of Acre, and 2 years later, Ali agreed to withdraw from the territories in return for being recognised as the autonomous ruler of Egypt and Sudan, while remaining, in theory, under nominal Ottoman rule. Intervening to protect Ottoman territorial integrity against a rebellious governor was one thing. Intervening to protect this same thing against a European power whose military and political influence stretched across the continent and into Asia was another thing entirely. That being said, Britain was beginning to link the defence of the Ottoman Empire against Russian ambitions, as demonstrated by a letter in 1839 from the British Foreign Secretary and future Prime Minister Lord Palmerston, which he stated, quote, "Encroachment upon Turkey is no doubt an object at which Russia steadily aims, encroachment by acquisition of territory from the Sultan in time of war. Everything that tends to weaken Turkey tends to forward in this respect the views of Russia." End quote. To sum this all up, the Ottoman Empire clearly needed Britain as an ally to act as a deterrent against Russia from interfering in its affairs and from declaring war. One way of creating support for this was through an act of generosity on their part to Britain, in this case through donating relief towards Irish famine victims. The third and final way to view Ottoman relief is through the prism of what can be seen today as a PR campaign, that is, to improve the public perception of this empire in the eyes of the British population, which would in turn improve relations with this power. The Greek War of Independence against the Ottoman Sultan had significantly damaged the standing of this empire among not just the British public, but Western Europe as a whole. Many notable European figures, such as King Ludwig II of Bavaria, whose son would become the first king of Greece, King Otto I, were Philhellenes, who believed in the revival of an ancient Greek state in the model of ancient Greece, although many ordinary Greeks would not have viewed the war through this lens. In this regard, the British population generally regarded the Greeks as fighting a noble struggle, a sentiment that was further heightened when the celebrity and poet Lord Byron joined the Greek cause and became to be seen as a martyr when he died at Missolonghi in 1824 from an illness, not from actual fighting. Alongside this, the British press carried reports about Ottoman actions against the Greek rebels and would describe them as, quote, barbarians, a sentiment that was also reflected in the writings of Lord Byron. With all this considered, public sentiment forced the British, French and Russians to intervene on the side of the Greeks and to decisively defeat the Ottoman navy at the Battle of Navarino in 1827. The aftermath of this war resulted in an independent Greek kingdom in 1832, which set in motion the previously mentioned point of the Eastern question about what was to become of the Ottoman Empire when its territories, over time, became part of other nations or declared independence in their own right. It was also a public image disaster for the empire in the eyes of Europeans. What the Ottoman Sultan from 1839, Sultan Abdulmajid I, needed to do was to perform an act that would greatly improve the public perception of himself and his empire in Western Europe. On the other hand, such an act can be also regarded as an attempt to be viewed as a kind and just ruler among his subjects, while also enhancing his status as caliph, the generally viewed spiritual and political leader of Islam, a position which the Ottoman sultans maintained from 1517 to 1922, and following the abolition of the title of Ottoman Sultan that year to the ending of the Caliphate in 1924, would be held by a member of the Ottoman dynasty. Charity, like in many religions, is an important duty for followers of this faith, and performing it on a grand scale would serve to strengthen the status of Abdulmajid I as a devout Muslim among the Islamic clergy and the general population as a whole, something made even more important at a time when the empire was engaging in westernization that would have been seen as both foreign and going against centuries of tradition among Muslims both in the empire and abroad. The opportunity to perform this act would appeal to both domestic and foreign audiences and would present itself over the course of the Irish Famine from 1845 to 1852. Before looking in detail about Ottoman awareness to the Irish Famine and the aid provided to help ease the suffering. We'll park it here and take a short break. See you all soon. Welcome back. Before the break, we were talking about the Irish Famine, the Ottoman Empire, and the reasons why the Sultan of this state would give famine relief to people who appeared far away from his territories and who had little to do with his interests. Now we'll be focusing on how aware Ottoman society was of the Irish Famine and the nature of the aid they provided. Ottoman awareness of the Irish Famine appears to have been apparent from the onset, as demonstrated by references to it from the autumn of 1845 in Ottoman newspapers, starting with the partially private periodical Geschichte e Havadis, and later with the official journal Takvim i Vekayi. The language of Geschichte in referencing the famine appears to have been very evocative, an attempt to present its readers with an unvarnished, unsanitized image of the state of affairs in Ireland, with words such as the Irish were, quote, deprived of their means of making a living, and suffering levels which were impossible to express with words. The language here is certainly expressive, appealing to the senses of the readers, yet from a political standpoint it does not attempt to place the blame for this humanitarian crisis on Britain. Yet it does acknowledge that despite efforts from the British government, the large number of the starving population needed outside support. Geschichte, as mentioned before, was only partially owned in the private domain, and consequently any pinpointing of blame will be seen as an official position of the Ottoman government, which would have presumably left huge political ramifications between Britain and the Ottoman state. Nonetheless, the language present in this newspaper provides us with a glimpse into Ottoman views of the Irish famine, albeit from an educated, literate background. Benjamin C. Fortna suggests that the literacy rate of the Ottoman Empire in the middle of the 19th century was less than 10%, while the, quote, Turkish of this period was written not only in the official Arabo-Persian script, but also Armenian and Greek alphabets, furthering language complications. Nonetheless, the attitude of this class appears to be that an untold catastrophe was unfolding in Ireland, and that greater support was needed to avert further suffering, be it from Britain or indeed outside sources. In contrast, references to the famine in Takvim i Vekayi, the official gazette of the Ottoman Empire, seem to only appear in 1847, around the time that Sultan Abdulmajid I provided his donation to the British Embassy in Istanbul. The position of this journal, therefore, reflects the shift in Ottoman policy towards this crisis from initially one of concerned observation to later as an active participant in attempting to resolve this crisis. The references in Takvim also appear to be much more political in nature, in that they reference donations by Queen Victoria and various members of the royal family and high society. Semih Çelik argues that these references to Europe, be it through the donation of Queen Victoria or accounts of the famine-stricken Irish, aim to project the Ottoman ideology of this period, that it is a European power alongside other nations like Britain and France, which as such would require demonstrating an interest in European affairs. This argument very much fits in line with Haniolu's previous assertions that the Ottoman Empire was seeking recognition as a member of the concert in Europe, an act that would accompany internal reforms within the state. On the other hand, it could demonstrate an attempt to place the donations of the Ottoman Sultan with other individuals, something that, as will be demonstrated later, would cause disagreements in terms of how to respond to this crisis in an appropriate diplomatic way. In terms of physical Ottoman aid, the first reference to this comes from a letter written on the 3rd of April 1847 by Henry Wellesley, 1st Earl Cowley, to Lord Palmerston, acknowledging that the Sultan has inscribed £1,000, £86,959 in May 2024 for the relief of the Irish. Earl Cowley at this time was serving as the secretary to the British Embassy in Istanbul and acted as the Minister ad interim from 1846 to 1848 and later served as the British ambassador to France from 1852 to 1867. He himself had Irish connections, as his father, Henry Wellesley, 1st Baron Cowley, was born in Dangan Castle in County Meath, who was himself the brother of Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington, who famously defeated Napoleon at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815. The reference in this letter is brief, yet it does come with a brief note by Earl Cowley, noting that he viewed the Sultan's donation, quote, as a great progress in civilization. In this sense, the British perception towards the Ottoman Empire at this time appears to be one of a nation that has not yet reached levels of European sophistication and was backward, a mindset that appears to be similar to Lord Byron's view, albeit without the claims of the savagery and barbarity. Nonetheless, it should be acknowledged that the great progress in civilization represented by this donation was clearly something that improved the British opinion towards the state, and this would be demonstrated in a letter addressed to Earl Cowley from Britain, stating that the Sultan's act as, quote, furnishing the strongest evidence that the Sultan will not left satisfied with endeavouring to connect Great Britain and Turkey by ties of surely political or commercial character, but would also seek to establish the connection between the two countries upon the larger and more permanent legs of mutual goodwill and of friendly offices. End quote. In turn, the British appear to have confirmed in a letter of acknowledgement that the £1,000 was received by the embassy in Istanbul, with the British ambassador visiting the Ottoman government departments known as the Bab-i-Ali, with the embassy staff to convey thanks in person. This then appears to have been followed by a formal letter of thanks written by the British ambassador to Sultan Abdulmajid I on behalf of Queen Victoria. When looking at the donation of the Ottoman Sultan, it would appear that his role in providing relief was minimal, limited to just donating the £1,000. However, in a letter dated the 26th of May 1849 to the Foreign Office, it is acknowledged that the gentlemen who signed a letter of thanks to the Sultan were accompanied to a private audience with Sultan Abdulmajid I in Istanbul. At this meeting, Sultan Abdulmajid I stated that, quote, he hoped the people of Ireland would never henceforward experience a similar calamity, adding that what he had done on their behalf had been dictated by a new feeling of humanity and of sincere friendship for the government of Great Britain. End quote. Diplomacy as an avenue for friendship is clear here. However, there is perhaps other elements at play here than just diplomatic protocol. In this regard, we must consider the prospect that Sultan Abdulmajid I wished to donate a larger sum, but on the advice of the British Embassy was forced to scale it back. There is some early evidence for this, within a few years of the donation, in an 1849 issue of the Illustrated London News. Here, it describes the 1849 meeting between the Sultan and officials who signed the letter of thanks to him. However, the following quote is important to note. It is important that it should be known that the Sultan originally offered to send £10,000, £869,595 in May 2024 to Ireland, as well as some ships laden with provisions. It was, however, suggested at the time by His Majesty's ministers that it would not be proper for a foreign sovereign to make so large a donation, and that £1,000, which was half the sum contributed by Queen Victoria for the same purpose, would be sufficient. End quote. The phrase His Majesty's Ministers is intriguing, as it suggests that Sultan Abdulmajid I was persuaded from not donating more, not by British officials, but by his own ministers. It suggests that the advisors of the Ottoman Sultan were aware of diplomatic protocol and did not wish to offend Queen Victoria. However, this account towards Sultan Abdulmajid I's donation is not the only piece of documentation about scaling back his aid. Another piece of evidence is present in a biography of Sultan Abdulmajid I, published in 1854, called The Sultan of Turkey, Abdulmajid Khan, A Brief Memoir of His Life and Reign, by the Reverend Henry Christmas. The difference compared to the other reference is that it suggests rather vaguely that, quote, it was intimated to him, the Sultan, that it was thought right to limit the sum subscribed by the Queen, without indicating directly who convinced him to change his opinion. More direct evidence for this debate appears to be present in the diary of William J. O'Neill Daunt, an Irish politician who served briefly as a Member of Parliament representing Mallow in the south of Ireland from 1832 to 1833 and was known as an Irish nationalist. In entries dated the 17th and 18th of January 1853, he writes that a quote, Mr. McCarthy visited the author, whose father is physician to the Sultan, and recalled that Sultan Abdulmajid I, quote, had intended to give £10,000 to the famine-stricken Irish, but was deterred by the English ambassador Lord Cowley, as Her Majesty, who had only subscribed £1,000, would have been annoyed had a foreign sovereign given a larger sum. End quote. The reference to Mr. McCarthy appears to be grounded in truth. A note to a Dr. McCarthy first appears in the Edinburgh Medical and Surgical Journal in 1831, in which he and a quote, Dr. McGuffog are rewarded by the confidence of the higher ranks of the empire and a reputation amongst every denomination of people, perhaps never surpassed in Constantinople, end quote, suggesting that his reputation had reached the ears of the Ottoman Sultan of the time, Mahmud II, the father of Abdulmajid I, who passed away in 1839. This appears to be confirmed in an article for the Cork Examiner in September 1841, when this doctor is acknowledged as Dr. Justin Washington McCarthy, one of the attendants on the deceased emperor. It is not clear if McCarthy had any Irish nationalist political leanings. However, the reference to him in the Edinburgh Medical and Surgical Journal describes him and McGuffog as, quote, Englishmen, and would suggest that McCarthy was a member of the Anglo-Irish community in Ireland. That being said, the fact that the Cork Examiner, which was founded as a vehicle for the Irish nationalism of Daniel O'Connell, the famed Irish politician who played a key role in achieving Catholic emancipation, raises questions about McCarthy's mention in it. The references to McCarthy in such a positive manner as a physician to the Ottoman Sultan Mahmud II would have been unlikely had he been someone who was not an Irish nationalist, given the newspaper's political outlook. With all this considered, it raises the question as to whether McCarthy, who presumably kept on his role as physician to the Ottoman Sultan following the death of Sultan Mahmud II, if we are to believe Daunt's reference, influenced Sultan Abdulmajid I's decision to provide aid, not through the lens of facilitating good relations with Britain, but rather through humanitarian grounds and the inadequacy of the British response to this crisis. Returning to the decision by the Ottoman Sultan to scale back aid, we must consider all the evidence as to why this happened. While the Illustrated London News acknowledges that it was the Ottomans on their part who decided to limit the donation to £1,000, on the other, the McCarthy reference suggests the British were responsible for convincing the Ottoman Sultan. Further to this, while Daunt's diary entry is dated nearly 4 years later than the news article, it has a much more convincing source of evidence. In this regard, I am more inclined to agree with the point that it was the British ambassadorial officials, not Ottoman ministers, that convinced the Sultan to limit his donation. Daunt's account, with the connection of McCarthy to the Sultan, appears to hold up, as demonstrated by the previously mentioned evidence. Further, as a British publication, that would naturally be sympathetic to the point of view of Britain, it would make sense for the Illustrated London News to suggest that the Ottomans themselves decided to avoid a diplomatic incident in not donating more for famine relief. On the other hand, an Irish newspaper, the Weekly Freeman's Journal, would directly assert in November 1853 that the Sultan's, quote, benevolent intentions towards the Irish people were most cruelly frustrated by the English ambassador at the port, although we should note that this newspaper was an Irish nationalist journal. This perception would have been heightened alongside the sanitised visit to Ireland by Queen Victoria in 1849, marking a, quote, symbolic end to the famine, with its main highlight being the renaming of the town of Cove to Queenstown in her honour, and not including trips to Ireland's most worst affected regions. By placing it as the responsibility of the Sultan's advisers, it also takes away from the perception that by convincing Sultan Abdulmajid I to scale back, Britain was exerting undue influence on Ottoman policy. A sense of cultural backwardness could also have been at play here, demonstrated by the previous point of Lord Cowley's attitude to Ottoman, quote, civilization, and that the British were trying to influence Ottoman politics for their own public image, even if it meant that less aid was going to be made available and thus more lives lost. While it is difficult to definitively prove either theory, the view presented in Daunt's diary seems not only credible, but indicates that the British, while welcoming to Ottoman efforts to provide relief, did not want to be seen as weak in terms of donations on their part. Alongside the money donated by Sultan Abdulmajid I, £570, £68,000 in May 2024, was also raised within Istanbul itself, which was later sent to London and acknowledged in a letter to Earl Cowley on the 7th of May 1847, coupled with another donation of around £113, £13,500 in May 2024, raised and confirmed on the 3rd of August 1847. With these sums in mind, we should ask who exactly within the city was donating to famine relief. There was clearly a British presence within Istanbul, demonstrated by officials among the embassy and merchants, among others, that could explain the sum of money raised. However, Lord Cowley acknowledged in a letter dated the 31st of March 1847 the, quote, unnatural level of money raised by the non-foreign residents of the city. Semih Çelik has pointed to the efforts of the Société de Saint Vincent de Paul in raising famine relief, and attributes these sums as being collected by this group. As a Catholic charity, there appears to have been an emphasis on providing aid to the Irish people. There were approximately 6.5 million Catholics in Ireland in 1840, according to David W. Miller, and as such there appears to have been an effort by the Society to demonstrate the difference between the British in Istanbul and the Irish, while also attempting to place the need for aid within a broad humanitarian vision of both the Irish and Ottomans as, quote, the sons of Adam. Thus, the Société de Saint Vincent de Paul's ability to be able to convince individuals within the Ottoman Empire to donate appears to be the result of appealing to religious sentiments while making a clear distinction between British and Irish people. In short, the Ottoman response to the Irish famine appears to be born out of a need for furthering relations with Britain, while also wishing to appear as a friend, if we are to believe the Ottoman Sultan's own statements, upon receiving the letter of thanks. The British government appears to have welcomed the aid provided, however they were clearly reluctant to accept further aid, as it could tarnish their image of providing adequate aid to easing suffering, and could damage their image abroad. Finally, people within the Ottoman Empire appear to have been motivated to donate funds by both religious sentiments and a distinction between the Irish and the British, drawn by the Société de Saint Vincent de Paul. Alongside this official response, there was also a public response to this, found in newspapers in Britain and in Ireland. An early reference to this act comes in a brief article in the Times newspaper on the 15th of April 1847, noting the donation of £1,000, quote, to the Honourable Mr. Wellesley, to be disposed of by him in the best way towards their, the Irish, alleviation. a donation it describes as an act of liberality. Curiously, the earliest mention in an Irish newspaper to the Sultan's donation comes in the newspaper The Nation from the 17th of April, but it repeated the wording of the Times without any comment regarding this act's, quote, liberality. The Nation was an Irish newspaper that had nationalist sentiments, favouring the independence of Ireland from Britain, and as such it would be expected that it would be much more complimentary towards the nature of Sultan Abdulmajid I's donation. This can be understood when we consider how new this information was, coupled with the level of communication technology at this time, and the fact that there was not enough news about this act to add anything else, alongside possible editorial considerations for more important news in Ireland itself. As the news of the famine relief spread, more and more time became devoted to discussing the importance of this deed, particularly in matters relating to Christianity and Islam. On the 21st of April 1847, the London Morning Post wrote, quote, "For the first time, a Mohammedan sovereign representing multitudinous Islam populations manifests spontaneously a warm sympathy with a Christian nation. May such sympathies in all the genial charities of a common humanity be maintained between the followers of the Crescent and the Cross." End quote. The Church and State Gazette would also include an article on the 23rd of April 1847 repeating the sentiments word for word and stating that the Sultan had shown, quote, "the true spirit of Christianity, and there is more of it in the Mohammedan Sultan of Turkey than in any or all of the Christian princes of Eastern Europe." End quote. With language such as this, the readers could be forgiven that Sultan Abdulmajid I was exceedingly favourable to all Christians. However, there is more to the Sultan's reputation than just donating relief for the Irish famine. In 1847, roughly the same time as he gave £1,000 to the British Embassy in Istanbul, he would vow to build a Protestant chapel for the English workmen employed in ironworks near Constantinople, while promising to abolish slave markets in the empire. Considering all these combined actions, it is perhaps no wonder that the public's impression of the Ottoman Empire was changed for the better. This can be further demonstrated in an article in the previously mentioned The Nation newspaper on the 13th of October 1849, which in a poem called God Bless the Turk states, quote, "Let Ireland be grateful and pay back the alms that His Highness bestowed." End quote. As the 1840s became the 1850s, war clouds had gathered over Europe, and in 1853, war broke out between the Ottoman and Russian empires. The causes of this conflict vary, but they were principally found on the basis of whether Orthodox Christians, represented by Russia, or Catholics, represented by France, would control the Christian holy sites in the Holy Land, coupled with the domineering attitude of Russia to the Ottomans, of which Britain and France's opposition to this are apparent. These powers would formally join the side of the Ottomans in 1854, followed by the Kingdom of Sardinia in 1855, the same kingdom which united Italy a few years later. While references in British newspapers to the Sultan's aid appear to be few, and thus not a factor in convincing public opinion to rally behind this empire, in Ireland, however, the opposite appears to be true. For example, on the 2nd of March 1853, the Belfast newsletter stated, quote, "It was the present Sultan of Turkey who, more generously than any other European potentate, contributed to the relief of our famine-stricken countrymen in 1847. In a similar way, a brief article in the Cork Examiner in February 1854 discussed Sultan Abdulmajid I's donation of £200, £18,585 in May 2024, to the Institut Historique of France, presumably in thanks to French support during the war, also writing that it would be remembered that the Sultan offered to send 1 million piastres for the relief of the Irish during this time of scarcity. Finally, on the 24th of June 1854, the Nation would include extracts from Christmas's biography of the Ottoman Sultan, concerning his aid to the Irish. The timing of the last two articles, despite not directly mentioning the Crimean War, were written in the midst of this conflict, and as such the readers must have been aware of the wider context for the inclusion of such articles in these works. Nor was participation of Irish soldiers in the Crimean War minimal, as Irishmen made up an estimated 40% of the army and 20% of the navy at this time, according to Paul Huddie in his book The Crimean War and Irish Society. While the reminders of Ottoman generosity in the Belfast newsletter, the Cork Examiner and the Nation, among many others, were perhaps not the main reason for Irishmen taking part in this conflict, with sources of income and a sense of adventure serving as the main driver for recruitment, one cannot deny that the Sultan's donation was well documented and publicised in the press of this time. As such, it would be reasonable to assume that public memory to the Sultan's aid was still fresh in the popular memory in Ireland and played a certain role in convincing the Irish public to favour him in the war against Russia. To conclude this episode, I would like to mention a 2010 visit to Turkey by the President of Ireland, Mary McAleese. In Ankara, she acknowledged the help that the Ottoman Empire gave to the Irish, while also mentioning that the same empire sent 3 ships with food to the Irish port of Drogheda, which would adopt the Star and Crescent as its coat of arms, a symbol associated with Islam, the Ottoman Empire, and the modern Republic of Turkey. While notes in the contemporary newspapers the Drogheda Argus and Drogheda Conservative have since been unearthed that mention ships from Thessaloniki in modern Greece, arriving in Drogheda in May 1847, the fact remains that the city of Cork also received ships carrying Indian corn from not only Thessalonica but also Alexandria in Egypt. In both of these cases, it is more likely these acts were down to the initiatives of individuals rather than being sanctioned by higher authorities, be it local officials or Sultan Abdulmajid I himself. And yet this public perception within Ireland remains, as demonstrated by a plaque in Drogheda acknowledging rather ambiguously, quote, the generosity of the people of Turkey towards the people of Ireland, end quote. Further, the myth of the emblem of Drogheda also has been debunked, as this was its crest since the year 1210. The reasons for continuing this popular myth appear to be that stories such as this appear to fit with the traditional narrative of the Irish Famine as evidence of British indifference to Ireland, in that a foreign sovereign went out of his way to assist a people he did not know, whereas Queen Victoria would be accused of disinterest during these years, being labelled as, quote, the Famine Queen by nationalists in Ireland, despite donating £2,500, £173,919 today to help alleviate suffering. Just as Irish popular memory is selective as to what is chosen to be remembered in the public imagination, so too the same can be said about the popular British opinion towards the Ottoman Empire. Despite the positive perception among British newspapers towards this state from Sultan Abdulmajid I's donation and later the allied nature of Britain and the Ottomans during the Crimean War, all of this would be forgotten or dismissed in subsequent years. The images of later sultans in the eyes of the British public, such as in Sultan Abdul Hamid II, the son of Abdulmajid I, would not be as generous as that of his father, particularly in the 1890s, changing British and Irish public perception of the Sultan for the worst. Thus, depending on the situation, certain events and deeds in history may be forgotten or erased from the public memory due to political circumstances. Popular memory may well distort historical events, yet in some circumstances the overall importance of actual events and their significance in history can still be maintained. While Britain may well have forgotten the aid sent in the 1840s, Ireland, as seen by the plaque in Drogheda and statements by former Irish President Mary McAleese, certainly has not. That's all for today. I've attached in the description books that I would recommend to find out more about the different topics mentioned in the episode, and link to my master's thesis from which this episode is largely based on. Episode 3 will be looking at how the Italian Renaissance influenced the Ottoman Empire through the Venetian artist Gentile Bellini and his patron Sultan Mehmed II the Conqueror. Until next time, keep her lit.